Good evening. I'm Dr. Michael Fagel-Luby from Texas Christian University and past president of the Division for Learning Disabilities. Welcome to this session for DLD at Night, called Changing the Locus of Control, Culturally, Linguistically, and Ability-Relevant Lesson Plans for Pre-Service Teachers. We have a wonderful slate of presenters tonight, and we'll let them introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Dr. Steve Prismus. I'm an assistant professor of bilingual education here in the College of Education at TCU and a faculty member of the Answers Institute.
And yes, I'm India Lindo. I'm an associate professor in the area of special education at TCU and one of the Answers Institute faculty as well.
All right, let's get started. So we thought it might be a nice place to start when we talk about what's going on in schools, to recognize frequently this RTI triangle that we talk about, the 80, 20, 15, 5, these are frequently upside down in schools. And so we want to reflect on this idea of, are you and your multi-tiered system upside down? Do we find that more than 20% of kids need tier 2 instruction? They may be as high as 50% or 60% of students, as we've seen in some of our local schools. So what we want you to think about is reflecting on how might other cultural, linguistic, ability labels be playing out in the learning for these kiddos? What else might be going on? Is that tier 1 instruction really meeting the needs of kids, with all kids in your school? Our agenda tonight, there are 3 of us, and we're each going to take one of these elements. Steve Prismus is going to start us off with debunking what he calls ubiquitous service-based myths and language-based myths. He talks about monolingual and monoable paradigms and surrounding the intersection of language needs and disability. He'll set the stage for us around why that upside down pyramid might be there. Then Dr. India Lindo will talk a little bit about addressing the pathologizing of students of color in particular, based on monocultural and monolingual paradigms that lead to disproportionate disciplinary school actions. And then I'll finish with a little bit around culturally and linguistically relevant and ability relevant explicit instruction frameworks. We know that so much about our instruction will play out for the differences that are made with these individuals. We're going to talk about one way we do that here at TCU. We hope you enjoy the session. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Prismus, and he's going to introduce himself a little more and continue for our first section.
Hey, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here tonight and sharing with my colleagues, India and Michael. Always enjoy sharing with them and learning from them, and it's a pleasure to provide this information. I am a professor of bilingual education. My area is educational linguistics. I teach courses in TESOL, in bilingual education, sociolinguistics, and when possible, I look at the intersection of language disability and language difference, and that's where we're going tonight. So my section is going to be largely on educational myths around disability and difference in language and what to do about those myths. So I want to start off by sharing 3 service-based myths, and these come from the Texas Education Agency, who have also identified these as pretty ubiquitous myths, these misperceptions that show up in schools, not only here in Texas, but around the United States as well. The first myth is this idea that educators and service providers in schools need to choose between bilingual education and special education. And that's just not true. And I feel like it's the most basic thing we need to take away from tonight, is that if a student qualifies for both support from both programs, they have the right to access services from each program. The Admission Review and Dismissal Committee and the relationship with the Language Proficiency and Assessment Committee should be a symbiotic relationship. One does not override the other. So the ARD and the LPAC need to work in concert to make the best decision about the needs of kids. One does not have more power than the other. One does not override decisions in a school. And then finally, and this is a big one that I will talk about in a couple minutes here when I get to some language-based myths, is this idea that if a student's special education services are in English, the student might as well be taken out of bilingual education and placed in ESL only. It's kind of a sort of a confusing statement, because a lot of schools, including myself, will consider services provided by ESL under the umbrella of bilingual education. So a lot of times this is even worse. When a child gets identified for services in special education, a lot of times parents are convinced to sign denial paperwork that takes them even out of ESL services, and they get completely just all English. This requires a mindset shift. If a bilingual student receives instruction in both languages, language of special education services should not limit his access to bilingual program. So starting with these service-based myths, I want to take a look now at the language-based myths that underlie these and get to a real big inequitable issue at hand. And that's emergent bilinguals with disabilities are being removed from bilingual programs, such as dual language classrooms, in order to focus just on their English skills. If I think about my current context here in Fort Worth, Texas, I'm in a lot of local schools. The elementary school of my youngest daughter, I can think of 5 kids in the last 5 years that have been taken out of dual language programming, out of bilingual education, after they qualified for special education services. And I think about another school where my partner, who is a bilingual speech language pathologist, works at. It's a fairly common occurrence where a classroom teacher will approach her and say, I really think that due to this child's language-based disability, they need to be taken out of bilingual education, focused just on English. And it's legally not the right thing to do, and it's not the right thing to do for the identity, language, and academic development of the child. So let's get into some of the possible myths that are underlying these ideologies. So I'm going to share 4 myths that have been documented in the literature. Specifically, the National Academies put out a book in 2017. Chapter 10 is all about dually identified students, dual language learners, who we used to call English language learners, or ELs. Some people say emergent bilinguals. My colleagues here at Texas Christian University say active bilingual learners, users of English, able students. And these are the 4 myths that are commonly associated with able students who also have qualified for special education. So the first myth: exposure to or learning more than one language will overwhelm and confuse children with disabilities. I would like you all to notice that I've bolded phrases or words in each one of these myths. And I want you to make a sort of a mental note, because we're going to return back to that. So the bolded words in this myth are more than one language. And Michael, if you can advance it, thanks. For each one of these, there's going to be the research that shows up. So we've got close to 2 decades worth of research that indicates there's no evidence of confusion, and that kids who grow up in bilingual, multilingual households and communities view the use of bilingualism and multilingualism as just what they do. And the idea that this somehow is confusing comes from a monolingual paradigm. It comes largely from people who speak one language and think, oh, that must be confusing for that child to communicate bilingually or multilingually. Well, the evidence doesn't bear that out. We've got nothing to show that these kids are confused or overwhelmed. Number 2, code switching practices of active bilingual learners, users of English students are evidence of confusion. This is a really big myth. And the research here, again, from that National Academy's book, 2017, some of my own work with Manuel Alvarado in 2019, show that not only is it not evidence of confusion, but we can actually leverage the code switching practices or the translanguaging practices of students so that they are able to show more content and language knowledge at school. In the area of linguistics and bilingual education, we have data going back to the early 1980s, large data sets of bilingual individuals code switching, and the corpus analysis, the language analysis, the discourse analysis of their speech is they just don't make mistakes. You know, they place content words and functional words, regardless of named language, in the right spot in a sentence, even if the sentence has more than one named language to it. If I say, esta tarde me voy al mall to buy a gift, you heard two named languages, but I didn't violate any syntax or grammar rules. Number three, existing learning and language deficits will be worsened by exposure to more than one language. And here again, we see more than one language bolded. I'm setting us up for something in about 5 minutes here, limiting the ability of these students to successfully learn English. This is probably the biggest one. If we look at these four myths, we see confusion, and then we see some idea of bilingualism worsening the learning and language abilities of able students with disabilities. K. Raining Bird, in a special issue in 2016, Pearson, many people have taken a look at the bilingualism, the language practices of students with language impairment, with Down syndrome, with autism spectrum disorder, with intellectual disabilities, and have shown that they perform as well, if not better, to monolingual students with the same disabilities. They actually outperform monolingual students when all of their languages are counted. So if we think back to the sentence I said about going to the mall and buying a gift, if you counted that as good language, as you should, then bilingual kids like myself are demonstrating even more in terms of vocabulary. And so again, there's no evidence that bilingualism will worsen existing learning and language deficits. The opposite is true. We have more evidence to show that allowing kids to use those linguistic resources will benefit them at school. And then finally, able students should stop using their first language at home and school in order to learn English. And again, we see bolded here some idea of first language or second language or more than one language, or this idea of switching between codes. The research here is overwhelming that kids' positive identity development is important for their emotional development, their academic development. And when we ask students to stop using their first language at home, we're essentially taking away an intimate emotional communication connection to their parents or other family members who speak that first language. We're also disrupting a really important routine, which can have negative consequences for students. So absolutely number 4 needs to be debunked and done away with because there are major psychological, emotional, academic consequences for asking students to stop speaking a first language at home. I want to show a little demonstration here, and this will set us up for the next conversation that we're going to have with my part. And I want us to think about students as if they were these bottles of juice. We often in schools will separate students by their named languages. We'll say, just speak English or just speak Spanish. And I'm talking about this one here because the number 4, if you tell someone to stop using their first language at home or at school, it's like taking this completely away. Well, we can see there's knowledge in here, there's identity in here, and of course there's knowledge and identity in here too, because the student is an emergent bilingual or an able student. But when we think about specifically students, able students with language-based disabilities, we don't want to take resources away from them. We want them to use and leverage all of their resources. So clearly, we want them to continue developing English at school and at home and in the community, because there's knowledge and identity involved with that. And clearly we want them to also keep using the knowledge, the identity, the socialization, their funds of knowledge that come from their socialization in Spanish. And what we're advocating for here, oh, it's gonna make it. Oh, it's gonna make it. Oh, I better stop there. Is a whole student. We want students to be their whole selves. And what that means is allowing them and encouraging them to communicate bilingually and to learn and be assessed bilingually as well. I'm going to take a drink so that I don't spill this by mistake. Okay, so the last thing I'll share is, if we have all this research that debunks these myths, why do these myths still persist? And I think it has something to do with this very strong monolingual paradigm that is informed by an incomplete perspective of bilingualism. So if educators and service providers are going through the day with a monolingual paradigm, unconsciously mostly, then they're viewing bilingualism from just half or just the external perspective. And then that view of an incomplete understanding of bilingualism in turn strengthens the monolingual paradigm. So I want to show a visual of this. And I love this image because outside of the individual, we see distinct colors, and we can put a name to them. We could say that that red is Spanish or English, and that blue is Turkish or Urdu, that green is Somali, and that yellow is Zapotec. And when you hear someone talking, indeed, you do hear distinct languages. And we call this, and Michael, you can go on, thanks. We call this the external view of bilingualism. And it does sound like people are switching between codes, but this is just half of the understanding of what bilingualism is. Inside the brain of the individual doing the speaking, we see all of those languages are together in one linguistic system, that white area. And indeed, there's overlap. They're not separated in the linguistic system. Sometimes words are phonetically stored together. Sometimes they're semantically stored together. If I think of casa and cucaracha, they might be both. Phonetically, casa and cucaracha shared together or stored together in my lexicon, but they're semantically there too, because where do we find cucarachas? Sometimes, unfortunately, in the casa. So the internal perspective, what we call translanguaging or languaging across or trans-named languages, represents what the student can do when allowed to use their whole language. This is their general linguistic competence. No longer do we think named languages like Spanish and French and English. We just think additional linguistic features. I'm adding linguistic feature A, B, C, whatever. So what we're going to do, if you can go one more slide, Michael, thank you. We want to bring up from my last slide the 4 myths again. Take a look at what we've highlighted in myth 1, more than one language, myth 2, code switching, myth 3, more than one language, myth 4, first language. And I would like you to accept that these myths are just based on an external view of bilingualism. If we were to somehow replace those bolded phrases with something that would represent also the internal view, like additional linguistic features, then now let's put these myths to a test. Let's try that. Number one, exposure to or learning additional linguistic features will overwhelm and confuse children with disabilities. That's absurd. That's like saying stop learning language altogether. Let's try number two. Using additional linguistic features is evidence of confusion. That's ridiculous. Number three, existing learning and language deficits will be worsened by exposure to additional linguistic features. That's like saying just stop talking to kids. And able students should stop using additional linguistic features at home and at school in order to learn English. Absurd. The takeaway is we want kids to use all of their language. Not only is it good for them for identity development, it's good for them for all language identity development and academic development as well. However, we keep debunking these myths and deficit ideologies of otherness still exist. So how can we address the pathologizing of students of color based on monocultural, monolingual paradigm that leads to disproportionate disciplinary action, disproportionate services, and disproportionate expectations at school? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. I like ABLE and really thinking about those additional linguistic features. As we transition, I'll just remind you that I'm India Lindo and I'm an associate professor here. I'm also the immediate past president of CEC's Division for culturally and linguistically diverse exceptional learners. And I'm the current Project 2020 project chair as well. So my area focuses on building reading comprehension as far as my personal research line and learning difficulties with our students who are struggling or have identified learning disabilities, but also looking at how we can implement and enhance kind of school and community-based interventions with a real focus lately on how do we build teacher competence and teaching competence specifically in the domains that we are concerned about for our learners. So if you can advance. One of the reasons I think this is such an important aspect, and I really have leaned into the cultural competence component, is that our 2019 CEC came out with their State of the Special Education Survey. And one of the key things or key takeaways was that our teachers rated themselves lower in competence in working with our diverse learners, particularly with diverse families who were of different socioeconomic levels, ethnic and racial groupings, or in different linguistic features. And so it just really is clear to us that that's been an ongoing issue for our students. And as our teaching force continues to be about 80% white women primarily, our student populations, especially in certain urban areas particularly, are incredibly diverse and growing even faster than initial estimates were. So we really have to figure out how we can manage this disconnect that often happens between the teacher's experience and the students that they're engaging. Could you advance? And so when I talk about competence, and we ask the question of competence, we talk about it as a sense of knowledge and praxis. And know that it's domain specific. Like I may feel like I'm an exceptional reading teacher, but I'm not necessarily when it comes to dealing with certain individuals with linguistic differences, or I'm not so great when it comes to certain domains like, teaching chemistry, that may not be my thing. So that does, recognizing that there's certain domains of this that I really may feel are weaknesses, as our teachers have expressed. And so when knowledge, we're talking about what are in the realm of cultural competence, understanding the cultural differences and awareness of stereotypes and bias are an important aspect for us bridging that disconnect we feel. And then practice is really applying those principles, skills, and strategies that help students from diverse backgrounds be successful. And part of that, Dr. President was leading to or discussing this, some of the assumptions we make about language and how we should serve individuals. Can you advance? I've already alluded to the cultural gap that we often see. And like I said, in some places, if you see on there, they say 50% of our students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. I think in our local district, it's more like 70 something percent. So it varies tremendously. And we know that cultural experiences influence behaviors and interactions. It shapes our values, our beliefs, our customs, and our traditions. So the way we exist and believe we should interact is shaped by the cultural experiences we have. And we don't all have the same ones. So this lack of competence may lead to lack of awareness and misinterpretation of cultural features. It can lead to inappropriate referrals and placements in instructional decisions broadly. And we often see it perpetuates the cycle of low expectations and minoritization of students. Next. And you all have probably seen this cultural iceberg image, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it, but I did just want to remind you that when we talk about these things, they're those things that we see easily. I'm an African-American woman, that's no secret. My food, my dress, dance may be something that I wear on my shoulder. But there are other rules, unspoken rules about personal space, how we communicate non-verbally, eye contact. That may play a role, and it may be a racial ethnic thing, it may be a regional thing. Like I'm a Southern woman, and I think there's certain things that I realize about myself as I don't look people directly in the eye in some ways, or certain aspects that I've had to shift norms about. And there are also unconscious rules, tone of voice, attitude towards elders. There are just some people I cannot call by their first name at certain ages. It's just, I'm not going to call you that. I know you're my colleague, but it just feels weird. And in my own concept of self, whether or not, how we communicate. So just being aware of those things about myself shapes how I interact, or recognizing, hey, this may be uncomfortable for me and this is why. Or I should be aware, and what I should interpret from exchange may vary based on having some of these, this knowledge of different groups. Next. All right. So again, culture is groupness. I had mentioned being African-American. I'm also from New Orleans, which I think is its own cultural group. There are just plenty of things that shape my existence and many of our others. And so it's a shared history, shared values, shared patterns of behavior. Next. And so I just wrote down a few things that we think about when we think culture and identity, as far as race, ethnicity, age, gender, faith, geography, language. But there are other factors that play a role in our existence and shaping, like socioeconomic status, our organizational membership and occupations shape us. We spend a lot of time, many in those realms. Sexual orientation may do so. Shared family history or other shared history, and abilities are just a few. Next. So I want you to think, what of these things maybe feels important to you as we move through and think through this next section of the presentation. For example, for me, I think being a Black woman is an important aspect of my identity. It shapes how I enter the world. I think being from New Orleans shapes a lot of, my choices and things. My faith certainly does. My language or lack of language proficiency in some areas. My last name is Lindo. I'm married into a Panamanian Spanish-speaking family, and I do not speak Spanish, but people assume I do often. And I just go, I'm sorry, I'm not as proficient as I like to be. It's an area of growth for me. But just what are those things and how it shapes your interaction? Next. So, but with these identity features comes assumptions. I'm a Black woman. What does that mean? Am I loud? Am I this? Am I that? Are there biases that come in shaping those experiences? I'm from New Orleans. What does that mean? Of course, I love seafood. Yes, I do. But you shouldn't assume that. I could be allergic. Who knows? What are those things? And I think we fall on those biases and stereotypes. And sometimes because we're not comfortable and that lack of comfort or lack of exposure at times means I don't have much else to fall on. Next. So one of the things that I like you all to do is, you have grab a piece of paper and just kind of, as I told you earlier, think about some of those things that are, identifiers for you. And for me, I have my name there in the center. I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm New Orleans, and I'm a mother. Next. And with each of those, though, I can think of stereotypes that fit in this realm or that come through the assumption that I'm not open to certain identities because I'm a Christian, or I'm Black and that means that maybe I'm uneducated, or no one expects that I'm a college professor when they guess I'm in the grocery store and what do you do? It's like everyone's always shocked. I don't know why that is, but New Orleanian, of course, the seafood. I don't sound like I'm from New Orleans, I'm told a lot, until I get on the phone with my mama and them, and then it's like, oh yeah, you're from New Orleans. What are those things that come up? Being a mother shapes so much of my identity and what I'm doing and how I spend my day and time. But can you go to the next slide there? So as you think about the things that or represent you, I want you to think of also what are like I said, those kind of stereotypes that may come with it. For example, one of the ones I share often is, I am from New Orleans, but I am not a voodoo priestess. Because I was always amazed at how many people when I left for college were so afraid of me. And it's like, you dropped me off at the Lutheran church. Like, why are you worried about me doing voodoo? Like, that's a religion. Like, but that's a lack of knowledge, lack of exposure, and just kind of what you know about New Orleans and your beliefs, the stereotypes. Next. So here's some others. I'm a very tall Black man. I'm not a basketball player. I hear that, from people on campus. Or I'm a Black student on this campus. I'm not an athlete. I get that one a lot too from my students. I'm a Hispanic immigrant worker, but I'm not uneducated. And I'm not, let's not say but, and I'm not uneducated. Next. I am an African-American single mother, and I'm not on public assistance. Next. I'm a white veteran police officer, and I'm not a racist. In our moments. So part of the issue is the assumptions we make. We fall back on assumptions that we have and in the images that are often portrayed. The assumptions and conclusions, and let's work on myths versus facts. For example, in the African-American woman example I just gave, there are fewer African-Americans on public assistance than by sheer number, but the assumption is because of the stereotypes we often see that, maybe there's disproportionate, impoverished, these kind of lens. We receive about 11 million pieces of information at any given moment. And our brain only processes about 40 bits of it. And so we take shortcuts. We do this all the time. And we encourage students to do these things, take in some information and draw conclusions. The problem is when there's stereotypes and other assumptions, and we may need to push past. Next. So when it comes to, mind, when you hear certain terms, I want you to think about this. What assumptions might you make about people who fall in this category? Next, Black. What's the first thing? Hispanic. You can go to next. Free and reduced lunch. Next, poverty. Title I school. Single parent. Incarcerated parent. What are the assumptions that we make about those individuals, right? I think, in my mind, when I hear people talk about that, oh, it's a Title I school. Yes, there's economic issues that by definition with Title I. But I think we shouldn't assume that there are no resources there. Like, it may not be the monetary resources that we tend to value, but what are the resources? What are the assets? And so when I hear these things, it's like, I feel like I see a house in the mind of people. It's like a house, all the kids are in a tenement and it's falling apart. There's food insecurity. The kids clearly unsupervised and home alone. And I don't know if any of those things are true. Can you go to the next one? Because my reality as a Black student of a single parent with an incarcerated parent at one point with, free and reduced lunch. One, there's a big difference between free and reduced and what that means economically, but also what are those realities? Yes, my mother was a single mother, But I had a 2-parent home. My aunt and parent lived with me. This is a house that, in my neighborhood I grew up in, and I lived across from a public golf course. I had a serious addiction to Sweet Valley High, and my mom worked for the Singer Theater. So I went to lots of Broadway shows. I was in ballet and dance and a majorette. That's actually a picture of me marching in a parade in the green and white because I'm from New Orleans and that's what we do. And I played piano for 13 years and everyone in my family had to learn how to play piano. So the assumption of that person may not fit, the stereotypes you have, that may not be their reality. And I had plenty of friends who had single parents and lived, or had Title I status or free and reduced lunch status and had similar experiences to my own. So I want you to avoid thinking of these individuals as a monolith. Yes, there is disproportionate economic issues. There may be issues of food insecurity. It may not be. There may be other things, but we should find out and get to know, push past those initial assumptions. Next. And so I just caution you as you think about these things, I have the caution tape around the school there, you have information and you can make inferences, but you want to be conscious of the underlying assumptions and potential biases are there. So be conscious about those things. That doesn't say not to use information we know about groups to inform, but don't assume that rule applies to every individual in the group. And for your particular students, get to know them. Next. So I encourage you to really think about a strengths-based approach to how you engage students, families, schools, the neighborhoods. What are the assets? Maybe they don't have big stores, but they've got a corner market and a system of networks that encourages children to engage in communication with adults and to barter and to this. I mean, there's a support system that's there that may not look like the support system you expect, but it's there and it's vibrant and rich and supportive. And, I never wanted for books and I certainly was never hungry. But what are those things that are experienced? And kids, maybe there's no judgment to that, but be mindful. What are their assets? Don't focus on what their potential liabilities are, and recognize how you can support and leverage those assets. Next. So part of that, and I think it's where it starts, is really us thinking about this process of developing competency and cultural competency. And I think there's this institutional system of the school, the district, the values that we put and how we accept and include individuals, the policies that say we automatically put kids who have a linguistic difference in a different space, or kids who are definitely automatically need this or have different abilities, that we need to challenge. There's the instructional thing where the inner bubble, where I think we often focus. It's the curriculum we choose, whether or not we try to bring in different cultural books and norms and those things. But I think the big part that shapes both of those, the external bubble and the internal one, is our personal knowledge, our awareness of the stereotypes that we hold and how we enter into this world. Next slide. And so Bennett has this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity where people move through or find themselves at different stages from denial to integration. And the idea with denial is like, there's only one culture and there's cultural differences are not just experience. Everything that's not what I recognize is foreign. To integration, which is, we have a broader experience and we really can be these cultural brokers. We take on multicultural points of view. We're able to maneuver across cultures and shift cultural perspectives. Now, of course, as you can see from red to green, we want to be closer on that end. But the reality is, can you advance? Most of the population that assessed in research falls in the minimization range. 66% of us, you can do one more, I think. And so, and that's this idea that I think many people thought was the right idea. And then now we're learning more of that it's just not. This sense of that we're a melting pot. I don't see color, we're all the same, because we don't want to highlight the differences. But in that, we're doing this erasure of important aspects of individuals' identity. For example, I remember being told as a scholar that I should, be seen as a researcher first and an African-American second. And I'm like, I'm not sure how I'm not African-American ever, but it is what it is, right? And so I knew the person meant that in a helpful way, but it was very minimizing, and it made me feel like I can't show up in the space as I am in a way that things that I can't change about myself. And so we have to be clear about that and think about the assumptions we make as we go into that. So we want to make sure we understand that everything doesn't apply equally, and this idea that we all meld. We have to be able to expand and accept a broader range of experiences. Next. All right, so I encourage you, because we're special education, we like mnemonics, to put your cap on. And so what that is engage in the act of cultural self-study. Think about what symbols and traditions do you participate in that you support, derive from your experience, your historical, your ethnic experience. And then how that shapes how you engage, how it may be dissimilar from the experience of your students or your colleagues, and take time to learn more about their experience too. And that's the A, acquiring that cultural knowledge of your students. Understand the different diversity and background. Not all Spanish-speaking people are the same. Being from Mexico, being from Honduras, those are different experiences, even being from different parts of Mexico. Notice about aspects of their cultural and personalities, and reflect on your own behaviors and reactions. Push through those initial assumptions and learn more. Put knowledge to practice, avoid those stereotype judgments, use and employ lessons and content that reflect the diversity of your students' experiences, and teach and set high, set high expectations. Again, learn about those students, acknowledge their experiences. One of my areas is we talk about engaging books that are diverse and multilingual, is that I'm like, well, I can't read them well. And I realized, hey, but I have students who can, and leverage that as a strength in the classroom and have them read it to you and engage and support those learning and teach you. So there are just lots of ways that you can embed that aspect. All right, next. So I want you to always just ask yourself, how culturally responsive am I? Really, how am I being? There's a self-assessment survey that we can provide you. You can find out, then there are lots of different ones out there. Engage in, what do I really know about my families, my students' families, and really this collaborative partnership that we want to make sure we're engaging in as far as trust, building trust, equality, a commitment is showing professional competence, respect, even if it's, different norms from your own, respecting that, recognizing those experiences, and just being reflective about your own classroom practice or instructional practice. Next. And so I guess I'll finish this with just remembering competence is knowledge and practice. You have to build the knowledge and you have to practice it. And it's an ongoing and iterative process. I'm constantly going through that process myself. It involves self-reflection, awareness and sensitivity, relationship building, communication, and connecting with the curriculum. So just keep working at it. Thanks. So, yes. I wanted to transition this, I guess, I'm sorry, about the instructional aspect. Dr. Fagella Luby is really going to get us into getting in. I've been talking about that personal, and he's going to get us into that instructional lens. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Lindo. You can see, everybody who's out there, how lucky our students are to be working with Dr. Prismas and Dr. Lindo. They have both described the complexity of what it means to teach in our classrooms, and they have given us a lot to think about. And of course, there's no one solution here. We would not be respecting the challenge in front of us as a society if we were to pretend that there's only one solution. But as Dr. Lindo said, and I really like, she talked about sort of putting on your cap, right? She talked about that P step around putting knowledge into praxis, saying, using, and teaching. Let me get rid of this for a minute here. But that last step is this instructional element. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're going as far as our program, to think a little bit about how to help new teachers, pre-service teachers entering the field, meet some of these needs and be mindful of everything that they've talked about so far. Okay, so in brief here, I'm Dr. Michael Fagella-Luby, and I currently direct the Answers Institute for Special Education Research and Service here at TCU. And as I mentioned off the top, it was my privilege to serve as president of the Division for Learning Disabilities that's sponsoring DLD at Night tonight. I'm also currently a member of CEC's Committee on Divisional Relations, and I'll be doing that for the next year. My areas of research focus on individuals with learning disabilities and students at risk for learning disability identification, and really thinking about how do we enhance content area instruction without watering it down? How do we set and meet those high expectations that Dr. Lindo talked about? One of my favorite things to think about, my advisor at the University of Kansas was Don Deschler, and one of the projects he and I did looked at the significant difference between what we teach and how we teach individuals with learning disabilities. And it turned out it wasn't really so much of a difference around what we teach. The components of reading are just the components of reading. If you think about the National Reading Panel Big Five, the question is more about how do we teach those? And I've oftentimes thought of the concept of instructional tolerance, which Mike Gerber wrote about so eloquently. And I with my students, think a lot about these sort of scrunchies, right? And I ask myself the question when I frame it against what Dr. Lindo and Dr. Prisma said is how willing am I to stretch my practice to include as many students as I possibly can? I'm not asking us to just teach the top or just teach the top or just teach the bottom. I'm asking us to stay away from just teaching to the middle. I want us to think about that how, those practices that, again, enhance instruction for all. I'm reminded, thanks to Dr. Lindo, that I am from Boston, Massachusetts, which many people may assume that I like seafood. And while she does, I do not. So how we stretch, how we represent ourselves, an excellent reminder as we go forward. Now, for the audience tonight, I hope this is so familiar to us now. This is one way that in our field, Anita Archer and Charlie Hughes have helped our field operationalize 6 teaching functions around what we know works for kids with learning disabilities, this idea of explicit instruction. And they walk us through those functions that you might commonly see in a lesson plan, things like reviewing that critical information at the start, finding a way to present that information that involves stating the goals or the objectives very clearly, engaging in some sort of think aloud and modeling, making sure that we have clear language. But then also we recognize there's a mediation process happening here. The learning can't just stay with the teacher. It needs to move to the students so they can do something independently. And so we have guided practice and really the heart of good explicit instruction, which is this corrections and feedback, knowing that we as teachers look for patterns of error across our students, but also within the performance of a singular student to guide the kinds of practice opportunities that we're going to give them as they move into independent practice. So they can actually have this, again, the mediation from the teacher knowing how to do it to the student being able to do it with independence. One might argue with the self-regulation of self-determination. And then finally, of course, there's this idea of weekly and monthly reviews that we need to bring these ideas back if we expect students to be able to take them forward. So we were thinking about this sort of core idea. And I had the wonderful opportunity to co-teach a class with Dr. Prismas. So a little bit about our program to sort of set the stage. In TCU's College of Education, in our pre-service program, we have both a graduate program and an undergraduate program. Something that's really a point of distinction for our undergraduate program is that we offer all of our early childhood through 6th grade general education teachers actually 3 different areas of certification that are only certified as general education teachers. But thanks to the hard work of our faculty who recognize that teachers in schools will be serving the needs of both students, able learners, and students with disabilities, we shouldn't force them to choose one area of specialization because it would be the detriment of the other students in their class. And so we've been able to organize our courses so that students not only get that general education certification, but also special education certification and English as a second language certification. We even have a separate program where students can get bilingual certification. One of the interesting things about that is that because they develop those areas of expertise, we need to find out ways to blend that into classes. A couple of years ago, we had a new program, an alternative cert program here at the university. And in the design of the program, and many of you who are familiar with special education won't be surprised by this, They figured out the methods courses, they figured out the philosophy of ed courses. But when the plan of study came to the faculty, they realized that we had forgotten to include special education and bilingual education at any point in the program. And of course, that would be a problem, but now we've got no credit hours for it. So we got really lucky. I got really lucky in that I got to co-teach a class with Steve Prismas, who you've gotten to meet tonight and hear a little bit about his work. And in that process, we were able to, through our planning, some of you are teacher educators out there, and you know how choice it is to be able to partner with somebody and learn their new ideas. Well, I started talking about the importance of explicit instruction and what we needed to get our students to be able to do. And he started talking about many different models, one of which you may be familiar with, the SIOP model, and really thinking about these are the components that are really important. And as I would describe one and he would describe one, we actually found more in common than we found that was different. And so what he and I took on that summer was not just teaching the class, but we've revised the lesson plan template for our entire College of Education. And I just want to share with you 6 different components from that template that I think really help students maximize their language ability, ensure that their culture and identity is honored, but also that they blend in those personal life experiences. Basically that, again, this sort of cap, right? When I get down to that P and I have those high expectations, how do I do that for my students? And so we're going to follow this trend here. We're going to go from the top there under the explicit lesson plan format, critical reflection based on data, all the way down to clear wrap up and extension. Don't expect to see things here that you don't have in your own university, but maybe you'll have 1 or 2 that you can think about differently. I'll try and share those briefly. And if you need a copy of these forms, please reach out to us. The first big idea that we talk about is on the cover page of the lesson plan template. And we recognize that writing long, detailed lesson plans is something that across the field, we're having conversations about what is it we really want pre-service teachers to spend their time doing. Well, one of the first things that was important to us was that after they've taught a previous lesson, they need to do that reflecting on what worked and what didn't. But what we realized wasn't present in the template we used before was the students weren't providing data from formative assessments to inform that reflection. You know what it's like when they say, oh, well, I really think the kid learned a lot. Well, tell me about what you collected for data. We want to make sure that in individualized or large group instruction, we're actually getting that good formative assessment data so we can make instructional decisions. This is the first page of that lesson plan document. The box you see is not going to get filled. The students fill that box. We give them a specific point. And as the semester goes on, we ask that box to get a little bigger, right? That they really reflect in detail on the students that they're working with. The second big idea that really our collaboration used to inform the lesson plan is at the very top of the lesson plan format on the second page is that they need to complete an advanced organizer. And you'll see the fingerprints here of what Dr. Prismas and Dr. Lindo just talked about. In those first 2 boxes, talking about reviewing relevant previous learning, ensuring that any of the prerequisite skills and background knowledge or vocabulary are present. These are the first 2 things we ask students to do, to review and connect, and to make sure that there's knowledge of foundational skills so we can keep those high expectations. The next thing we did was revise the hook. And in many lessons, we talk about a hook to get the teacher's attention, to get the student's attention. But that hook is usually based on our pre-service teacher's interest, not on the students. So what we want them to do is have a hook that what our colleague Dr. Baumel calls isn't just cute, but it counts. A hook that helps the students draw attention to meaning right from the beginning, drawing from the best of cognitive psychology. And then finally, of course, we've got, what you'd expect, a materials section. I think the first big breakthrough that we had after data was this third element, this idea of objective and assessment alignment. In traditional lesson plan formats, the objectives are placed at the top and the assessments are placed at the bottom. And anyone here who's in pre-service education knows how frequently the objective has nothing to do with what's being assessed. And again, go back to that first thing, the teacher is reflecting on meaningful data. How do we do that? We actually moved to the top of that form, just under the advanced organizer you saw, this idea of including 4-part objectives. You can see them written there in kid-friendly language, but then we also aligned the language and processing objectives, articulating how will students learn these objectives? Will you use multiple modalities? Will you honor translanguaging? Will you ensure that cultural and linguistic diversity is present and you can capitalize on those strengths? And then finally, how does your assessment, whether formative or summative, align to all of those elements? And it's a really nice alignment at the top of the document because as a professor, I can actually see the beginning of the lesson plan, whether anything else underneath is going to make sense. Our next big breakthrough from our collaboration was this fourth element, changing the locus of control. So often what we were seeing in our undergraduate lesson plans was the teacher will do this, the teacher will do this, the teacher will do this, the teacher will do this. Students have independent practice. I just came back from visiting some schools out of state, and I spent the first 3 hours of the day watching exactly that kind of instruction. What we wanted to do was use, as Steve alluded to in his own work, this idea of how do we shift locus of control and how do we ensure that the thing on the left is not, if we as English readers left to right assume that that's of more importance, then how do we make sure there's a shift in control? So what we did was build into the lesson plan different chunks. The first one is, number one there on your screen, what is the teacher doing at the beginning of the lesson? And simultaneously or in parallel, what are the students doing? Frequently, that starts off with the teacher's talking and the students are listening or taking notes, right? But then what we did on purpose was we shifted those two boxes to physically remind the students of the need to shift the locus of control. So now, what is the student doing first? And then what is the teacher doing at the same time? Maybe now the students are engaged in the meaningful learning and the teacher is monitoring, providing feedback. And we provide room. They can flip those back to the teacher and then flip back to the student. Each of these elements was critical so that physically, as the students were writing these, they were shifting who was responsible for the learning. You can see another box on that page. And so we've also added this idea of embedding differentiation in tier one. I started off by talking about that idea of, is your triangle upside down? Frequently, that's because we don't see in the field that tier one instruction comes with its own differentiation. But of course, you all know that it must. So we give a physical reminder of that in the lesson plan template on the teacher side, because these are going to be the accommodations, the things that the teacher controls when it comes to differentiation. And so tier one differentiation then is, what are you going to do for the whole group? Our friends in the UDL world, I get to work a lot with Sean Smith, and he reminds me constantly, this is a great place to intervene on behalf of everyone, to level the playing field. But then also, I might have targeted students in my class that I want to make sure I know exactly what interventions or what kinds of accommodations I'm providing for those students in the whole group instruction. Again, we provide this visual reminder. It tracks across as the teacher moves and shifts in locus of control, and that shift in responsibility takes place. Finally, when we think about the end of our lesson plan, everyone should have some sort of wrap up, right? Sort of we come back to reinforcing these big ideas. Well, that's an important part of the lesson, to look back over those objectives and take the students through it. But we also added in a separate box to ensure that there's a lesson extension plan, that we connect to the students' lives outside the classroom. I mainly worked with high school students and middle school students, those students that would turn to us and say, so what, teach? Why we got to learn this stuff? Well, one of my favorite things about that question is when I can answer it, because I've planned for each of these big ideas then has a natural extension into their lives. And when it doesn't, it forces me as a teacher, maybe me as a pre-service teacher, but also an in-service teacher out in the field, to really consider, why am I teaching this element of grammar? Why am I teaching this stoichiometry way of solving problems in chemistry? I really need to think about how each of those impacts our student. I want to finish off here by just a brief little advertisement and sharing a little bit of information about the Answers Institute. Again, if you would like to get copies of any of these forms or anything we've talked about tonight, please reach out to us. You'll see resources at answersinstitute.tcu.edu. You can actually follow us on Twitter. I feel like I'm doing a commercial, right? But one of the nice things about our Twitter feed is twice a week, we send out tweets. One are free evidence-based practices, things that come into your Twitter feed that you can use with the kids in your classrooms. Hope you'll sign up for that Twitter feed. And the other thing we do is we talk about profiles of our graduate students or partnerships that we have in the community. They're a nice way to stay engaged. Our institute is really interested in leading change in special education and making sure that we transform the quality of life and learning for students with disabilities, their families, through research and evidence-based practice. That means partnership with those of you who are in education. I'm going to ask everybody to turn their cameras back on here, and we are going to open things up to questions from you. I want to say thank you so much for listening to this first part of our presentation, but our hope is that this is where the real conference gets started, that DLD at Night is really about connecting so that we can be together and discuss these larger issues. So at this time, we're going to turn things over to you, and we'll handle your questions. Thank you.